sitting quietly, doing nothing. In both life and art, the cultures of the Far East appreciate nothing more highly than spontaneity or naturalness. Zuran. This is the unmistakable tone of sincerity, marking the action which is not studied or contrived. For a man rings like a cracked bell when he thinks and acts with a split mind, one part standing aside to interfere with the other, to control, to condemn, or to admire. But the mind, or the true nature of man, cannot actually be split. According to a Zen poem, it is like a sword that cuts, but cannot cut itself, like an eye that sees, but cannot see itself. The illusion of the split comes from the mind's attempt to be both itself and its idea of itself, from a fatal confusion of fact with symbol. To make an end of the illusion, the mind must stop trying to act upon itself, upon its stream of experiences, from the standpoint of the idea of itself, which we call the ego. This is expressed in another Zen poem as, sitting quietly, doing nothing, spring comes, and the grass grows by itself. This, by itself, is the mind's and the world's natural way of action, as when the eyes see by themselves, and the ears hear by themselves, and the mouth opens by itself, without having to be forced apart by the fingers. As the Zen says again, the blue mountains are of themselves blue mountains. The white clouds are of themselves white clouds. In its stress upon naturalness, Zen is obviously the inheritor of Taoism, and its view of spontaneous action as marvelous activity, Miao Yung, is precisely what the Taoists meant by the word De, virtue with an overtone of magical power. But neither in Taoism nor in Zen does it have anything to do with magic in the merely sensational sense of performing superhuman miracles. The magical or marvelous quality of spontaneous action is, on the contrary, that it is perfectly human, and yet shows no sign of being contrived. Such a quality is particularly subtle, another meaning of miao, and extremely hard to put into words. The story is told of a Zen monk who wept upon hearing of the death of a close relative. When one of his fellow students objected that it was most unseemly for a monk to show such personal attachment, he replied, "Don't be stupid. I'm weeping because I want to weep." The great Hakuin was deeply disturbed in his early study of Zen when he came across the story of the master Yen Tu, who was said to have screamed at the top of his voice when murdered by a robber. Yet this doubt was dissolved at the moment of his satori, and in Zen circles his own death is felt to have been especially admirable for its display of human emotion. On the other hand, the abbot Kwaisen and his monks allowed themselves to be burned alive by the soldiers of Oda Nobunaga, sitting calmly in the posture of meditation. Such contradictory naturalness seems most mysterious. But perhaps the clue lies in the saying of Yun Men. For walking, just walk. In sitting, just sit. Above all, don't wobble. For the essential quality of naturalness is the sincerity of the undivided mind, which does not dither between alternatives. So when Yen Tu screamed, it was such a scream that it was heard for miles around. But it would be quite wrong to suppose that this natural sincerity comes about by observing such a platitude as, "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might." When Yen Tu screamed, he was not screaming in order to be natural, nor did he first make up his mind to scream, and then implement the decision with the full energy of his will. There is a total contradiction in planned naturalness and intentional sincerity. This is to overlay, not to discover, the original mind. Thus, to try to be natural is an affectation. To try not to try to be natural is also an affectation. As a Zen poem says, You cannot get it by taking thought. You cannot seek it by not taking thought. But this absurdly complex and frustrating predicament arises from a simple and elementary mistake in the use of the mind. When this is understood, there is no paradox and no difficulty. Obviously, the mistake arises in the attempt to split the mind against itself. But to understand this clearly, we have to enter more deeply into the cybernetics of the mind, the basic pattern of its self-correcting action. It is, of course, part of the very genius of the human mind that it can, as it were, stand aside from life and reflect upon it, that it can be aware of its own existence, and that it can criticize its own processes. For the mind has something resembling a feedback system. This is a term used in communications engineering for one of the basic principles of automation, of enabling machines to control themselves. Feedback enables a machine to be informed of the effects of its own action in such a way as to be able to correct its action. Perhaps the most familiar example is the electrical thermostat, which regulates the heating of a house. By setting an upper and a lower limit of desired temperature, the thermometer is so connected that it will switch the furnace on when the lower limit is reached and off when the upper limit is reached. The temperature of the house is thus kept within the desired limits. The thermostat provides the furnace with a kind of sensitive organ, an extremely rudimentary analogy of human self-consciousness. The proper adjustment of a feedback system is always a complex mechanical problem. For the original machine, say the furnace, is adjusted by the feedback system. But this system, in turn, needs adjustment. Therefore, to make a mechanical system more and more automatic will require the use of a series of feedback systems. A second one to correct the first, a third to correct the second, and so on. But there are obvious limits to such a series, for beyond a certain point the mechanism will be frustrated by its own complexity. For example, it might take so long for the information to pass through the series of control systems that it would arrive at the original machine too late to be useful. Similarly, when human beings think too carefully and minutely about an action to be taken, they cannot make up their minds in time to act. In other words, one cannot correct one's means of self-correction indefinitely. There must soon be a source of information at the end of the line which is the final authority. Failure to trust its authority will make it impossible to act, and the system will be paralyzed. The system can be paralyzed in yet another way. Every feedback system needs a margin of lag, or error. If we try to make a thermostat absolutely accurate, that is, if we bring the upper and lower limits of temperature very close together in an attempt to hold the temperature at a constant 70 degrees, the whole system will break down. For to the extent that the upper and lower limits coincide, the signals for switching off and switching on will coincide. If 70 degrees is both the lower and the upper limit, the go sign will also be the stop sign. Yes will imply no, and no will imply yes. Whereupon the mechanism will start trembling, going on and off, until it shakes itself to pieces. The system is too sensitive, and shows symptoms which are startlingly like human anxiety. For when a human being is so self-conscious, so self-controlled, that he cannot let go of himself, he dithers or wobbles between opposites. This is precisely what is meant in Zen by going round and round on the wheel of birth and death, for the Buddhist samsara is the prototype of all vicious circles. Now, human life consists primarily and originally in action, in living in the concrete world of suchness. But we have the power to control action by reflection, that is, by thinking, by comparing the actual world with memories or reflections. Memories are organized in terms of more or less abstract images, words, signs, simplified shapes, and other symbols which can be reviewed very rapidly, one after another. From such memories, reflections, and symbols, the mind constructs its idea of itself. This corresponds to the thermostat, the source of information about its own past action by which the system corrects itself. The mind-body must, of course, trust that information in order to act, for paralysis will soon result from trying to remember whether we have remembered everything accurately. But to keep up the supply of information in the memory, the mind-body must continue to act on its own. It must not cling too closely to its own record. There must be a lag, or distance, between the source of information and the source of action. This does not mean that the source of action must hesitate before it accepts the information. It means that it must not identify itself with the source of information. We saw that when the furnace responds too closely to the thermostat, it cannot go ahead without also trying to stop, or stop without also trying to go ahead. This is just what happens to the human being, to the mind, when the desire for certainty and security prompts identification between the mind and its own image of itself. It cannot let go of itself. It feels that it should not do what it is doing, and that it should do what it is not doing. It feels that it should not be what it is, and be what it isn't. Furthermore, the effort to remain always good or happy is like trying to hold the thermostat to a constant 70 degrees by making the lower limit the same as the upper. The identification of the mind with its own image is, therefore, paralyzing because the image is fixed. It is past and finished. But it is a fixed image of oneself in motion. To cling to it is thus to be in constant contradiction and conflict. Hence Yun Men's saying, "In walking, just walk. In sitting, just sit. Above all, don't wobble." In other words, the mind cannot act without giving up the impossible attempt to control itself beyond a certain point. It must let go of itself, both in the sense of trusting its own memory and reflection, and in the sense of acting spontaneously, on its own, into the unknown. This is why Zen often seems to take the side of action as against reflection, and why it describes itself as no mind, wu shin, or no thought, wu nian, and why the masters demonstrate Zen by giving instantaneous and unpremeditated answers to questions. When Yun Men was asked for the ultimate secret of Buddhism, he replied, "Dumpling." In the words of the Japanese master, Takuan, when a monk asks, "What is the Buddha?" the master may raise his fist. When he is asked, "What is the ultimate idea of Buddhism?" he may exclaim, even before the questioner finishes his sentence, "A blossoming branch of the plum," or the cypress tree in the courtyard. The point is that the answering mind does not stop anywhere, but responds straight away, without giving any thought to the felicity of an answer. This is allowing the mind to act on its own. But reflection is also action, and Yun Men might also have said, "In acting, just act. In thinking, just think. Above all, don't wobble." In other words, if one is going to reflect, just reflect, but do not reflect about reflecting. Yet Zen would agree that reflection about reflection is also action, provided that in doing it we do just that, and do not tend to drift off into the infinite regression of trying always to stand above or outside the level upon which we are acting. Thus, Zen is also a liberation from the dualism of thought and action, for it thinks as it acts, with the same quality of abandon, commitment, or faith. The attitude of Wu Xin is by no means an anti-intellectualist exclusion of thinking. Wu Xin is action on any level whatsoever, physical or psychic, without trying at the same moment to observe and check the action from outside. This attempt to act and think about the action simultaneously is precisely the identification of the mind with its idea of itself. It involves the same contradiction as the statement which states something about itself. This statement is false. The same is true of the relationship between feeling and action. For feeling blocks action, and blocks itself as a form of action, when it gets caught in this same tendency to observe or feel itself indefinitely, as when, in the midst of enjoying myself, I examine myself to see if I'm getting the utmost out of the occasion. Not content with tasting the food, I am also trying to taste my tongue. Not content with feeling happy, I want to feel myself feeling happy, so as to be sure not to miss anything. Whether trusting our memories or trusting the mind to act on its own, it comes to the same thing. Ultimately, we must act and think, live and die, from a source beyond all our knowledge and control. But this source is ourselves, and when we see that, it no longer stands over against us as a threatening object. No amount of care and hesitancy, no amount of introspection and searching of our motives can make any ultimate difference to the fact that the mind is like an eye that sees, but cannot see itself. In the end, the only alternative to a shuddering paralysis is to leap into action regardless of the consequences. Action, in this spirit, may be right or wrong with respect to conventional standards, but our decisions upon the conventional level must be supported by the conviction that whatever we do, and whatever happens to us, is ultimately right. In other words, we must enter into it without second thoughts, without the arrière-pensée of regret, hesitancy, doubt, or self-recrimination. Thus, when Yun Men was asked, "What is the Tao?" he answered simply, "Walk on. Chew." But to act without second thought, without double-mindedness, is by no means a mere precept for our imitation. For we cannot realize this kind of action until it is clear beyond any shadow of a doubt that it is actually impossible to do anything else. In the words of Wang Bo, men are afraid to forget their own minds, fearing to fall through the void, with nothing onto which they can cling. They do not know that the void is not really the void, but the real realm of the Dharma. It cannot be looked for or sought, comprehended by wisdom or knowledge, explained in words, contacted materially, that is, objectively, or reached by meritorious achievement. Now, this impossibility of grasping the mind with the mind is, when realized, the non-action, wu-wei, the sitting quietly, doing nothing, whereby spring comes and the grass grows by itself. There is no necessity for the mind to try to let go of itself, or to try not to try. This introduces further artificialities. Yet as a matter of psychological strategy, there is no need for trying to avoid artificialities. In the doctrine of the Japanese master Bankei, 1622 to 1693, the mind which cannot grasp itself is called the unborn, fusho. The mind which does not arise or appear in the realm of symbolic knowledge. A layman asked, "I appreciate very much your instruction about the unborn, but by force of habit, second thoughts, nian, keep tending to arise, and being confused by them, it is difficult to be in perfect accord with the unborn. How am I to trust in it entirely?" Bankei said, "If you make an attempt to stop the second thoughts which arise, then the mind which does the stopping, and the mind which is stopped, become divided, and there is no occasion for peace of mind. So it is best for you simply to believe that originally there is no possibility of control by second thoughts. Yet because of karmic affinity, through what you see and what you hear, these thoughts arise and vanish temporarily, but are without substance. Brushing off thoughts which arise is just like washing off blood with blood. We remain impure because of being washed with blood, even when the blood that was first there has gone. And if we continue in this way, the impurity never departs. This is from ignorance of the mind's unborn, unvanishing, and unconfused nature. If we take second thought for an effective reality, we keep going on and on around the wheel of birth and death. You should realize that such thought is just a temporary mental construction, and not try to hold or to reject it. Let it alone just as it occurs and just as it ceases. It is like an image reflected in a mirror. The mirror is clear and reflects anything which comes before it, and yet no image sticks in the mirror. The Buddha mind, that is the real unborn mind, is 10,000 times more clear than a mirror, and more inexpressibly marvelous. In its light, all such thoughts vanish without trace. If you put your faith in this way of understanding, however strongly such thoughts may arise, they do no harm. This is also the doctrine of Wang Bo, who says again, if it is held that there is something to be realized or attained apart from mind, and thereupon mind is used to seek it, that implies failure to understand that mind and the object of its search are one. Mind cannot be used to seek something from mind, for even after the passage of millions of kalpas, the day of success would never come. One must not forget the social context of Zen. It is primarily a way of liberation for those who have mastered the disciplines of social convention, of the conditioning of the individual by the group. Zen is a medicine for the ill effects of this conditioning, for the mental paralysis and anxiety which come from excessive self-consciousness. It must be seen against the background of societies regulated by the principles of Confucianism, with their heavy stress on propriety and punctilious ritual. In Japan, too, it must be seen in relation to the rigid schooling required in the training of the samurai caste, and the emotional strain to which the samurai were exposed in times of constant warfare. As a medicine for these conditions, it does not seek to overthrow the conventions themselves, but on the contrary, takes them for granted, as is easily seen in such manifestations of Zen as the Cha no Yu, or tea ceremony, of Japan. Therefore, Zen might be a very dangerous medicine in a social context where convention is weak, or at the other extreme, where there is a spirit of open revolt against convention, ready to exploit Zen for destructive purposes. With this in mind, we can observe the freedom and naturalness of Zen, without loss of perspective. Social conditioning fosters the identification of the mind with a fixed idea of itself as the means of self-control, and as a result man thinks of himself as I, the ego. Thereupon the mental center of gravity shifts from the spontaneous or original mind to the ego image. Once this has happened, the very center of our psychic life is identified with the self-controlling mechanism. It then becomes almost impossible to see how I can let go of myself, for I am precisely my habitual effort to hold on to myself. I find myself totally incapable of any mental action which is not intentional, affected, and insincere. Therefore anything I do to give myself up, to let go, will be a disguised form of the habitual effort to hold on. I cannot be intentionally unintentional, or purposely spontaneous. As soon as it becomes important for me to be spontaneous, the intention to be so is strengthened. I cannot get rid of it, and yet it is the one thing that stands in the way of its own fulfillment. It is as if someone had given me some medicine with the warning that it will not work if I think of a monkey while taking it. While I am remembering to forget the monkey, I am in a double-bind situation, where to do is not to do, and vice versa. Yes implies no, and go implies stop. At this point, Zen comes to me and asks, if you cannot help remembering the monkey, are you doing it on purpose? In other words, do I have an intention for being intentional, a purpose for being purposive? Suddenly I realize that my very intending is spontaneous, or that my controlling self, the ego, arises from my uncontrolled or natural self. At this moment all the machinations of ego come to naught. It is annihilated in its own trap. I see that it is actually impossible not to be spontaneous. For what I cannot help doing, I am doing spontaneously. But if I am at the same time trying to control it, I interpret it as a compulsion. As a Zen master said, nothing is left to you at this moment but to have a good laugh. In this moment, the whole quality of consciousness is changed, and I feel myself in a new world in which, however, it is obvious that I have always been living. As soon as I recognize that my voluntary and purposeful action happens spontaneously, by itself, just like breathing, hearing, and feeling, I am no longer caught in the contradiction of trying to be spontaneous. There is no real contradiction, since trying is spontaneity. Seeing this, the compulsive, blocked, and tied-up feeling vanishes. It is just as if I had been absorbed in a tug-of-war between my two hands, and had forgotten that both were mine. No block to spontaneity remains when the trying is seen to be needless. As we saw, the discovery that both the voluntary and involuntary aspects of the mind are alike spontaneous makes an immediate end of the fixed dualism between the mind and the world, the knower and the known. The new world in which I find myself has an extraordinary transparency or freedom from barriers, making it seem that I have somehow become the empty space in which everything is happening. Here, then, is the point of the oft-repeated assertion that all beings are in Nirvana from the very beginning, that all dualism is falsely imagined, that the ordinary mind is the Tao, and that there is therefore no meaning in trying to get into accord with it. In the words of the Zheng Dao Ge, like the empty space, it has no boundaries, yet it is right in this place, ever profound and clear. When you seek to know it, you cannot see it. You cannot take hold of it, but you cannot lose it. In not being able to get it, you get it. When you are silent, it speaks. When you speak, it is silent. The great gate is wide open to bestow alms, and no crowd is blocking the way. It was through seeing this, in the moment of his satori, Hakuin cried out, "How wondrous! How wondrous! There is no birth and death from which one has to escape, nor is there any supreme knowledge after which one has to strive." Or in the words of Sheng Yen, "At one stroke, I forgot all my knowledge." There's no use for artificial discipline, for move as I will, I manifest the ancient way. Paradoxically, nothing is more artificial than the notion of artificiality. Try as one may, it is as impossible to go against the spontaneous Tao as to live in some other time than now, or some other place than here. When a monk asked Bankei what he thought of disciplining oneself to attain satori, the master said, "Satori stands in contrast to confusion. Since each person is the substance of Buddha, in reality there is not one point of confusion. What then is one going to achieve by satori?" Seeing then that there is no possibility of departing from the Tao, one is like Xuanjue's easy-going man, who neither avoids false thoughts nor seeks the true, for ignorance is in reality the Buddha nature, and this illusory, changeful, empty body is the Dharmakaya. One stops trying to be spontaneous by seeing that it is unnecessary to try, and then and there it can happen. The Zen masters often try to bring out this state by the device of evading a question, and then, as the questioner turns to go, calling him suddenly by name. As he naturally replies, "Yes," the master exclaims, "There it is." To the Western reader it may seem that all this is a kind of pantheism, an attempt to wipe out conflicts by asserting that everything is God. But from the standpoint of Zen, this is a long way short of true naturalness, since it involves the use of the artificial concept, everything is God, or everything is the Tao. Zen annihilates this concept by showing that it is as unnecessary as every other. One does not realize the spontaneous life by depending on the repetition of thoughts or affirmations. One realizes it by seeing that no such devices are necessary. Zen describes all means and methods for realizing the Tao as legs on a snake, utterly irrelevant attachments. To the logician, it will, of course, seem that the point at which we have arrived is pure nonsense, as in a way it is. From the Buddhist point of view, reality itself has no meaning, since it is not a sign pointing to something beyond itself. To arrive at reality, at suchness, is to go beyond karma, beyond consequential action, and to enter a life which is completely aimless. Yet to Zen and Taoism alike, this is the very life of the universe, which is complete at every moment, and does not need to justify itself by aiming at something beyond. In the words of a Zen-Rin poem, "If you don't believe, just look at September. Look at October. The yellow leaves falling, falling, to fill both mountain and river. To see this is to be like the two friends of whom another Zen-Rin poem says, meeting, they laugh and laugh. The forest grove, the many fallen leaves." To the Taoist mentality, the aimless, empty life does not suggest anything depressing. On the contrary, it suggests the freedom of clouds and mountain streams, wandering nowhere, of flowers and impenetrable canyons, beautiful for no one to see, and of the ocean surf forever washing the sand to no end. Furthermore, the Zen experience is more of a conclusion than a premise. It is never to be used as the first step in a line of ethical or metaphysical reasoning, since conclusions draw to it rather than from it. Like the beatific vision of Christianity, it is a which than which there is no whicher. The true end of man, not a thing to be used for some other end. Philosophers do not easily recognize that there is a point where thinking, like boiling an egg, must come to a stop. To try to formulate the Zen experience as a proposition, everything is the Tao, and then to analyze it and draw conclusions from it, is to miss it completely. Like the crucifixion, it is, to the Jews, the moralists, a stumbling block, and to the Greeks, the logicians, foolishness. To say that everything is the Tao almost gets the point. But just at the moment of getting it, the words crumble into nonsense. For we are here at a limit at which words break down, because they always imply a meaning beyond themselves, and here there is no meaning beyond. Zen does not make the mistake of using the experience, all things are of one suchness, as the premise for an ethic of universal brotherhood. On the contrary, Yuan Wu says, if you're a real man, you may by all means drive off with the farmer's ox, or grab the food from a starving man. This is only to say that Zen lies beyond the ethical standpoint, whose sanctions must be found not in reality itself, but in the mutual agreement of human beings. When we attempt to universalize or absolutize it, the ethical standpoint makes it impossible to exist, for we cannot live for a day without destroying the life of some other creature. If Zen is regarded as having the same function as a religion in the West, we shall naturally want to find some logical connection between its central experience and the improvement of human relations. But this is actually putting the cart before the horse. The point is rather that some such experience or way of life as this is the object of improved human relations. In the culture of the Far East, the problems of human relations are the sphere of Confucianism rather than Zen. But since the Sung dynasty, 959 to 1278, Zen has consistently fostered Confucianism and was the main source of the introduction of its principles into Japan. It saw their importance for creating the type of cultural matrix in which Zen could flourish without coming into conflict with social order, because the Confucian ethic is admittedly human and relative, not divine and absolute. Although profoundly inconsequential, the Zen experience has consequences in the sense that it may be applied in every direction, to any conceivable human activity, and that wherever it is so applied, it lends an unmistakable quality to the work. The characteristic notes of the spontaneous life are mo chi chu, or going ahead without hesitation, wu wei, which may here be understood as purposelessness, and wu shi, lack of affectation or simplicity. While the Zen experience does not imply any specific course of action, since it has no purpose, no motivation, it turns unhesitatingly to anything that presents itself to be done. Mo chi chu is the mind functioning without blocks, without wobbling between alternatives, and much of Zen training consists in confronting the student with dilemmas which he is expected to handle without stopping to deliberate and choose. The response to the situation must follow with the immediacy of sound issuing from the hands when they are clapped, or sparks from a flint when struck. The student unaccustomed to this type of response will at first be confused, but as he gains faith in his original or spontaneous mind, he will not only respond with ease, but the responses themselves will acquire a startling appropriateness. This is something like the professional comedian's gift of unprepared wit, which is equal to any situation. The master may begin a conversation with the student by asking a series of very ordinary questions about trivial matters, to which the student responds with perfect spontaneity. But suddenly he will say, "When the bathwater flows down the drain, does it turn clockwise or counterclockwise?" As the student stops at the unexpectedness of the question, and perhaps tries to remember which way it goes, the master shouts, "Don't think, act, this way," and whirls his hand in the air. Or, perhaps less helpfully, he may say, "So far you've answered my questions quite naturally and easily, but where's your difficulty now?" The student, likewise, is free to challenge the master, and one can imagine that in the days when Zen training was less formal, the members of Zen communities must have had enormous fun laying traps for each other. To some extent, this type of relationship still exists, despite the great solemnity of the Sanzen interview in which the koan is given and answered. The late Kozuki Roshi was entertaining 2 American monks at tea when he casually asked, "And what do you gentlemen know about Zen?" One of the monks flung his closed fan straight at the master's face. All in the same instant, the master inclined his head slightly to one side, the fan shot straight through the paper shoji behind him, and he burst into a ripple of laughter. Suzuki has translated a long letter from the Zen master Takuan on the relationship of Zen to the art of fencing, and this is certainly the best literary source of what Zen means by mo chi chu, by going straight ahead without stopping. Both Takuan and Bankei stressed the fact that the original or unborn mind is constantly working miracles, even in the most ordinary person. Even though a tree has innumerable leaves, the mind takes them in all at once without being stopped by any one of them. Explaining this to a visiting monk, Bankei said, "To prove that your mind is the Buddha mind, notice how all that I say here goes into you without missing a single thing, even though I don't try to push it into you." When heckled by an aggressive Nichiren monk, who kept insisting that he couldn't understand a word, Bankei asked him to come closer. The monk stepped forward. "Closer still," said Bankei. The monk came forward again. "How well," said Bankei, "you understand me." In other words, our natural organism performs the most marvelously complex activities without the least hesitation or deliberation. Conscious thought is itself founded upon its whole system of spontaneous functioning, for which reason there is really no alternative to trusting oneself completely to its working. Oneself is its working. Zen is not merely a cult of impulsive action. The point of Moji Chu is not to eliminate reflective thought, but to eliminate blocking in both action and thought, so that the response of the mind is always like a ball in a mountain stream, one thought after another, without hesitation. There is something similar to this in the psychoanalytic practice of free association, employed as a technique to get rid of obstacles to the free flow of thought from the unconscious. For there is a tendency to confuse blocking, a purely obstructive mechanism, with thinking out an answer. But the difference between the two is easily noticed in such a purely thinking-out process as adding a column of figures. Many people find that at certain combinations of numbers, such as 8 and 5, or 7 and 6, a feeling of resistance comes up, which halts the process. Because it is always annoying and disconcerting, one tends also to block at blocking, so that the state turns into the kind of wobbling dither characteristic of the snarled feedback system. The simplest cure is to feel free to block, so that one does not block at blocking. When one feels free to block, the blocking automatically eliminates itself. It is like riding a bicycle. When one starts falling to the left, one does not resist the fall, that is, the block, by turning to the right. One turns the wheel to the left, and the balance is restored. The principle here is, of course, the same as getting out of the contradiction of trying to be spontaneous through accepting the trying as spontaneous, through not resisting the block. Blocking is perhaps the best translation of the Zen term nien, as it occurs in the phrase wu nien, no thought, or better, no second thought. Takuan points out that this is the real meaning of attachment in Buddhism, as when it is said that a Buddha is free from worldly attachments. It does not mean that he is a stone Buddha, with no feelings, no emotions, and no sensations of hunger or pain. It means that he does not block at anything. Thus it is typical of Zen that its style of action has the strongest feeling of commitment, of follow-through. It enters into everything wholeheartedly and freely, without having to keep an eye on itself. It does not confuse spirituality with thinking about God while one is peeling potatoes. Zen spirituality is just to peel the potatoes. In the words of Lin Ji, when it's time to get dressed, put on your clothes. When you must walk, then walk. When you must sit, then sit. Don't have a single thought in your mind about seeking for Buddhahood. You talk about being perfectly disciplined in your 6 senses and in all your actions, but in my view all this is making karma. To seek the Buddha, nature, and to seek the Dharma is at once to make karma, which leads to the hells. To seek to be bodhisattvas is also making karma, and likewise studying the sutras and commentaries. Buddhas and patriarchs are people without such artificialities. It is said everywhere that there is a Tao which must be cultivated and a Dharma which must be realized. What Dharma do you say must be realized, and what Tao cultivated? What do you lack in the way you are functioning right now? What will you add to where you are? As another Zenrin poem says, there is nothing equal to wearing clothes and eating food. Outside this, there are neither Buddhas nor patriarchs. This is the quality of Wu Shi, of naturalness without any contrivances or means for being natural, such as thoughts of Zen, of the Tao, or of the Buddha. One does not exclude such thoughts. They simply fall away when seen to be unnecessary. He does not linger where the Buddha is, and where there is no Buddha, he passes right on. For as the Zenrin says again, to be conscious of the original mind, the original nature, just this is the great disease of Zen. As the fish swims in the water, but is unmindful of the water, the bird flies in the wind, but knows not of the wind, so the true life of Zen has no need to raise waves when no wind is blowing, to drag in religion or spirituality as something over and above life itself. This is why the sage Fa Yung received no more offerings of flowers from the birds after he had had his interview with the 4th patriarch, for his holiness no longer stood out like a sore thumb. Of such a man the Zenrin says, entering the forest, he moves not the grass. Entering the water, he makes not a ripple. No one notices him because he does not notice himself. It is often said that to be clinging to oneself is like having a thorn in the skin, and that Buddhism is a second thorn to extract the first. When it is out, both thorns are thrown away. But in the moment when Buddhism, when philosophy or religion becomes another way of clinging to oneself through seeking a spiritual security, the two thorns become one. And how is it to be taken out? This, as Bankei said, is wiping off blood with blood. Therefore in Zen there is neither self nor Buddha to which one can cling, no good to gain and no evil to be avoided, no thoughts to be eradicated and no mind to be purified, no body to perish and no soul to be saved. At one blow, this entire framework of abstractions is shattered to fragments. As the Zenrin says, to save a life it must be destroyed. When utterly destroyed, one dwells for the first time in peace. One word settles heaven and earth. One sword levels the whole world. Of this one sword, Lin Ji said, "If a man cultivates the Tao will not work. On all sides, evil conditions will head up competitively. But when the sword of wisdom, prajna, comes out, there's not one thing left." The sword of prajna, which cuts away abstraction, is that direct pointing whereby Zen avoids the entanglements of religiosity and goes straight to the heart. Thus, when the governor of Lung asked Yao Shan, "What is the Tao?" the master pointed upwards to the sky and downwards to a water jug beside him. Asked for an explanation, he replied, "A cloud in the sky and water in the jug."